welcome to tonight's story. Now sit and relax with me while we uncover the diabolical life of King Henry VIII and more in 4 immersive segments, titled Why It Sucked to be Married to Henry VIII, the king who made himself God, the tyrant of Tudor court, and last but not least, Henry's haunted legacy. But before we get started, I would really love to hear where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you now in the comments. I find it so fascinating, and it truly makes my day to connect with others from all over the world. So thank you for being here with me today. Now let's get started. Step into the velvet-draped halls of Tudor England. The scent of beeswax candles clings to the air. Courtiers whisper in corners, and at the centre of it all, one man with a crown and a temper. His name was Henry VIII. To marry the king was to be elevated beyond imagination. Gold, jewels, power. But for the 6 women who stood beside him at the altar, that power came at an unbearable cost. This is the story of 6 queens, of loyalty discarded, of innocence betrayed, of ambition punished. It is the story of how being loved by a king could kill you. Catherine of Aragon, the loyal queen, cast aside. She was just a teenager when she first came to England from Spain. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, princess of one of Europe's mightiest houses. She married Henry's brother, Arthur, but Arthur died, and so years later Catherine married the younger prince, Henry, who had just ascended the throne. Their early years were full of passion and hope. She bore him children, though only one survived, a daughter, Mary. Catherine was intelligent, politically savvy, and deeply respected, but Henry wanted more, specifically a son. And when years passed without another surviving heir, Henry's eyes wandered. Anne Boleyn appeared at court, charming, witty, elusive, and suddenly Catherine, after nearly 2 decades of faithful marriage, was declared no longer queen. Henry sought an annulment, claiming their marriage had been cursed by God because she'd been his brother's widow. Catherine refused to step aside. She fought him in court and in conscience, but power was on Henry's side. She died alone, banished from court, forbidden even to see her daughter. Her last letter to Henry closed with the words, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." But Henry had already moved on. Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her head. Anne Boleyn was everything Catherine was not. Young, fashionable, and politically sharp. She refused to be Henry's mistress, demanding he make her queen. And he did. In a whirlwind of court intrigue, England broke from the Catholic Church just to make the marriage happen. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons followed. The pressure was unbearable. Courtiers whispered, enemies circled. When Anne miscarried a boy in 1536, Henry snapped. Within months, trumped-up charges of adultery and treason were brought against her. 5 men were arrested, including her own brother. Torture and lies built the case. Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. Her execution was swift. A French swordsman was brought in to make the beheading clean. She knelt on the scaffold and prayed, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." She was not yet 36. Jane Seymour, the one who gave him a son. Just days after Anne's death, Henry was betrothed again, this time to Jane Seymour. Jane was quiet, devout, and everything Anne was not. And she gave Henry what he most desired, a son, Edward. But childbirth was treacherous. Just 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane died from complications. Henry wore black for months. He called her his true wife. but whether she was lucky or tragic is a matter of debate. She escaped his wrath, but only by dying first. Anne of Cleves, the one who escaped. Anne of Cleves was a German noblewoman. Henry agreed to marry her sight unseen, relying on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. But when she arrived in England, Henry was appalled. He declared she looked like a Flanders mare and refused to consummate the marriage. Anne, realizing her life might depend on her obedience, agreed to an annulment. In return, Henry gave her a generous settlement, a royal title, and let her live in comfort as his beloved sister. She lived peacefully for years, watching from a distance as other wives fell. She might have been the luckiest of them all. Catherine Howard, the teen bride, executed. Then came Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin. Just a teenager when she caught Henry's eye, she was playful, naive, and dazzling. Henry, now obese and plagued with ulcers, called her his rose without a thorn. But court politics was a nest of spies. Old relationships from Catherine's youth were exposed. Love letters, flings from before, and possibly during, the marriage. Henry flew into a rage. Catherine was arrested, dragged from Hampton Court, and held in the Tower. The night before her execution, she practised laying her head upon the block. On the scaffold, she whispered, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." She was only about 19. Catherine Parr, the survivor. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was a widow twice over and deeply learned. She acted more as nurse than wife, tending to Henry's wounds and temper. She also helped reconcile him with his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, securing their places in the line of succession. But even she came close to peril. When her reformist religious views angered conservative factions at court, an arrest warrant was drawn up. Catherine, sensing danger, threw herself at Henry's mercy, claiming she only debated religion to distract him from his ailments. It worked. She outlived him, but barely. Closing reflection, the price of being chosen. So, what did it mean to marry Henry VIII? For Catherine of Aragon, decades of devotion, then exile. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the scaffold. For Jane Seymour, death in childbirth. For Anne of Cleves, humiliation but safety. For Catherine Parr, survival through careful submission. Each woman became a pawn in a deadly game of ambition, fertility, and favour. And through it all, Henry grew more paranoid, more volatile, more dangerous. Behind the royal portraits and elaborate gowns were real women, frightened, isolated, and trapped in a gilded cage. To be loved by Henry was to walk a knife's edge. To be forgotten by him, that might have been the greatest mercy of all. Picture this. The marble corridors of Whitehall Palace echo with the heavy stomp of boots. Candles gutter against the draught of opening doors. In the throne room sits a man who once wrote a book defending the Pope, who now signs letters calling himself God's chosen ruler on earth. The year is 1534 and England is no longer Catholic, not because of holy revelation, but because Henry VIII wanted a son. But let's not start with the crown, let's start with the cross. Catherine of Aragon had been Henry's wife for nearly 24 years. She was intelligent, deeply devout, and once adored by Henry. But she had failed to produce a living male heir. Their only surviving child was Mary, bright, stubborn, but a girl. And to Henry, a girl could not secure the Tudor legacy. By 1527, Henry had fixated on Anne Boleyn, a sharp-witted lady-in-waiting who refused to become just another mistress. She wanted marriage, crown, legitimacy. Henry wanted her badly enough to challenge the Pope himself. At first, Henry didn't dream of rebellion. He wrote carefully crafted appeals to Pope Clement VII, asking for an annulment on the grounds that marrying his brother's widow, Catherine had been briefly wed to Henry's brother Arthur, was against biblical law. But the Pope stalled. Politically, he couldn't afford to alienate Catherine, who just happened to be the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So, month after month passed, then years, and Henry's patience, never thick to begin with, wore thin. By 1532, Henry's mind had shifted. If Rome would not bend, then England would simply stop listening. He appointed Thomas Cranmer, a reform-minded cleric, as Archbishop of Canterbury. In secret, Cranmer married Henry and Anne, and in 1533 the Archbishop declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. The Pope excommunicated Henry, but Henry did not back down. Instead, in 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the King the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was no mere paperwork shuffle. It was a thunderclap that echoed through every village, every monastery, every heart. The Pope was no longer the spiritual leader of England. The King was. For the first time in centuries, England had cut itself from the tree of Catholic Christendom, and at its root, not divine calling, but the will of one man. Not everyone bowed. Sir Thomas More had been Henry's friend, a brilliant scholar, and once his Lord Chancellor. But when asked to swear an oath acknowledging the King's supremacy over the Church, More refused. He stayed silent, refusing to speak against the King, but also refusing to acknowledge his spiritual claim. Silence was not enough. In 1535, after over a year in the Tower of London, More was executed. His last words were simple, chilling. "I die the King's good servant, but God's first." More's death sent a clear message. Henry's England would no longer tolerate ambiguity. To question the King's authority, even quietly, was treason. By the late 1530s, Henry began dismantling England's monasteries. Officially, it was a spiritual cleansing. Monasteries were accused of corruption, superstition, and false relics. In reality, it was a gold rush. Henry saw the Church's wealth, its lands, gold, and centuries-old artefacts, and claimed them for the crown. Over 800 religious houses were dissolved. Monks and nuns were cast out. Libraries were burned. Sacred treasures were melted down. Some abbots were hanged for resisting. The money was used to fund military campaigns and lavish palaces. To the peasantry, the transformation was bewildering. Overnight, the bell towers that had marked the rhythm of life fell silent. Parish altars were stripped bare. Saints disappeared from stained glass. Latin prayers gave way to English ones. It was as though the soul of England had been shaken loose. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion in the north in 1536, was fuelled in part by fury over the destruction of the monasteries. Thousands of commoners, clergy, and nobles rose in protest. They demanded the restoration of the old faith. Henry promised mercy, then executed the leaders. Across the country, neighbours turned on one another. Was your priest loyal to Rome or the King? Did your neighbour hide a crucifix or relic? Spies were everywhere. Heresy trials increased. People were imprisoned or burned for clinging to the faith of their fathers. For the average villager, it was a time of terror. A world that once felt eternal the rituals of birth, marriage, death, and salvation, was suddenly uncertain. The king no longer just ruled your body, he now claimed to rule your soul. In crowning himself head of the church, Henry didn't just shift power, he redefined it. He merged the spiritual and the secular collapsing centuries of tradition into his own appetite. He got what he wanted: Anne Boleyn for a while, a male heir, finally through Jane Seymour, and unrivaled authority. But he left behind a kingdom fractured. After Henry's death in 1547, England would swing wildly between Catholicism and Protestantism under his children. Mary the Ferns burned Protestants at the stake. Elizabeth Farm tried to walk a middle line. The chaos of Henry's Reformation lingered for generations. Henry VIII's break from Rome wasn't just an affair of the heart or a policy of power. It was a redefinition of divinity itself. He stood at the centre of a storm he helped create. And in making himself supreme head of the church, Henry didn't just reshape England, he dared to stand in God's place. The question still lingers centuries later. Was it vision or vanity? And what happens to a kingdom when its king believes his voice is louder than heaven's silence? Imagine stepping into the polished halls of Whitehall Palace in the 1530s. The scent of rosewater lingers in the air, mingling with the waxy warmth of freshly lit tapers. Musicians pluck lutes in the gallery. Courtiers laugh over goblets of wine, and a young noblewoman glides past in a dress heavy with pearls. But beneath the perfume and pageantry, something darker churns. You are in the court of Henry VIII, and here smiling is survival. One wrong word, one ill-timed glance, and the very velvet beneath your feet could turn to gallows wood. This is not just a royal court. It is a gilded arena, and the king who rules it, a man whose whims can crown you by morning and behead you by dusk. The king's enforcers, Cromwell and Wolsey. At the heart of this deadly dance stood two men who shaped, and were eventually destroyed by, Henry's courtly machine. Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son who rose to become the most powerful man in England after the king himself, began by teaching everyone a vital lesson. Brilliance would not save you. Henry adored Wolsey for his administrative genius, his ability to balance the kingdom's books, negotiate with Europe's kings, and arrange grand tournaments fit for gods. But when Wolsey failed to secure the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the king turned on him like a wounded lion. Stripped of titles, wealth and dignity, Wolsey died en route to his own trial. His crime? Disappointing the king. His successor, Thomas Cromwell, learned well from Wolsey's fall. Ruthless, efficient and always 2 moves ahead, Cromwell became Henry's chief architect in the Reformation. He masterminded the dissolution of monasteries, oversaw the execution of Anne Boleyn, and signed countless death warrants for traitors who had simply spoken their conscience. But even Cromwell could not outdance Henry forever. When Cromwell arranged a political marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves, hoping to shore up Protestant alliances, Henry was repulsed. Anne was too plain, too foreign, too unlike the seductive image her portrait had promised. The marriage was annulled, and Cromwell lost his shield. He was arrested during a Privy Council meeting in the middle of his duties, dragged to the Tower, and executed without trial. His head fell on Tower Hill, a chilling reminder that no man, no matter how loyal, could trust the king's favour to last. The courtier's masquerade serving in Henry's court meant living in a theatre of masks. noblemen crafted entire personas out of flattery, poetry, and calculated charm. They wrote verses to glorify the king, composed masks to flatter his moods, and presented lavish gifts that disguised fear as admiration. But beneath their jewelled collars beat terrified hearts. Even jesters had to be careful how they joked, because Henry's pride was the kingdom's most fragile treasure. To be favoured meant wealth and power. To lose that favour was to hear your name whispered in corridors, and to feel the cold breath of the Tower creeping in. Anne Boleyn's Meteor and Massacre. No one danced the Tudor court's blade edge more fatally than Anne Boleyn and her allies. Anne arrived as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, but quickly bewitched the king with her wit, style, and refusal to be merely a mistress. Her rise was meteoric. She became queen, bore Henry a daughter, and promised sons to come. Her family, particularly her brother George and her father Thomas Boleyn, rose with her, rewarded with titles and lands. But when Anne failed to produce a male heir and Henry's eye drifted, everything changed. Whispers of adultery, accusations of incest, a court trial steeped in lies. Anne's allies, her brother, her closest friends, even court musicians, were swept up in a purge so brutal it felt like a thunderstorm made of blades. Torture was used to force confessions. Testimonies were fabricated. Heads rolled like dice at a game where the king alone chose the rules. Anne's final words before her execution were calm, almost surreal. "I am come hither to die, and I die a good Christian woman." And then the sword fell. Psychological terror and the Tower. Perhaps the most insidious tool of Henry's tyranny wasn't the axe or the noose, but the slow drip of psychological warfare. Spies roamed the halls in servants' livery. Your closest friend might be feeding your words to the Privy Council. You might find your own signature forged onto a treasonous letter, or your wife questioned over things you said in your sleep. The Tower of London loomed in every nobleman's mind like a spectre. Some were sent there without charges, held for months in silence. Some confessed under duress. Others went mad in their cells, listening to the screams of executions from the yard. Every man in Henry's orbit knew he could be next. The Tyrant in Velvet. Henry was not always the ogre of legend. In his youth he had been charismatic, golden-haired, even idealistic. He was a poet, a composer, a skilled jouster, but power and paranoia curdled his spirit. By his later reign he had grown obese, plagued by ulcers, and consumed by suspicion. He wielded charm like a weapon. One day he might clasp your hand and call you brother. The next he might sign your death warrant between sips of wine. His court was built on fear, dressed in ermine. And while the masks and minstrels played on, the courtiers danced, carefully, desperately, always just inches from the blade. To serve in Henry VIII's court was to live in constant theatre, where you had to know your lines, wear your mask, and never, ever forget who held the power. The king was the sun. To be close meant warmth and the risk of burning alive. And so they smiled, and so they sang, and so they fell, one by one. Henry's haunted legacy. The year is 1547. The air in Whitehall Palace is heavy with the scent of rot, tallow candles and whispered prayers. In a grand but shadowed chamber, England's most infamous king lies dying. Once a golden prince of unmatched charm and promise, Henry VIII now resembles a cautionary tale carved in human flesh, bloated, fevered, his ulcerated leg leaking through the bedclothes. as his attendants shrink from the stench, and his physicians wring their hands, a kingdom holds its breath. Henry Tudor, the man who split a church to satisfy his will, has run out of time. But the damage he's wrought is just beginning to unfold. By the time of his death at age 55, Henry was nearly unrecognisable from the dashing young monarch who once jousted in golden armour and wrote love songs in French. Years of poor health, likely complicated by obesity, type 2 diabetes, and a chronic festering leg wound from a jousting accident, had transformed him into something almost spectral. The wound on his thigh, once just an injury, had become a weeping ulcer, oozing pus and emitting a smell so noxious that courtiers stood downwind of their sovereign. It never properly healed, a symbol of rot that clung to him both physically and metaphorically. Some whispered it was a punishment from God. Others, more quietly, wondered if it was a curse. In his final days, Henry was tormented not just by pain, but by the fear that his dynasty, so brutally crafted, would collapse without him. England was steeped in superstition. The night Henry died, strange lights were reported in the sky, auroras perhaps, or just winter lightning. An old prophecy once warned that a Tudor would die when 1,000 angels sang. As fate would have it, Henry died at the exact location called Sion Abbey, where a choir of angelic monks had once resided before he dissolved it. His coffin, bloated and poorly sealed, allegedly burst open en route to Windsor. Legend says the corpse oozed onto the church floor where dogs lapped at the royal fluids. To many it was divine retribution. Henry, who had desecrated monasteries and played God, now fed beasts in a holy place. Whether myth or morbid truth, the symbolism was clear. Henry's death did not end his influence. It only scattered the pieces of his legacy, bloody, brittle, and cursed. Henry left one legitimate male heir, Edward VI, born of Jane Seymour. But the child was fragile, a pale, bookish boy raised more by tutors than soldiers. He ascended the throne at just 9 years old, too young to rule, his kingdom managed by ambitious regents. Edward was a committed Protestant and a tool of reformist nobles. During his brief reign, the English church turned further from Rome, churches were stripped of icons and Latin was replaced with English. But behind the reforms, Edward was wasting away. Historians now believe he suffered from tuberculosis. His coughing fits grew worse, he became skeletal, and by 15 he was dead, leaving behind a Protestant nation with no Protestant heir. The throne next passed to his half-sister Mary, Henry's eldest daughter born of Catherine of Aragon, and Mary had not forgotten the wrongs done to her mother. Mary Tudor's reign is one of contradiction. She was deeply devout and personally courageous, but also unyielding in her mission to restore Catholicism. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, deeply unpopular with the English, was a political and religious alliance. It triggered rebellion and fear. Then came the burnings. Over 280 Protestants were executed under her command, burned at the stake as heretics, men, women, even teenagers. Some died praying in English as the flames took them. The image of Bloody Mary was born, fueled in part by Protestant propagandists like John Fox, but grounded in terrible truth. And still, Mary died childless. Once again, the Tudor hope for a secure dynasty crumbled into ash. The crown passed to Elizabeth, Henry's last surviving child. Elizabeth was everything her father both feared and failed to be: shrewd, self-reliant, and loved. Yet she too bore the burden of Henry's ghost. She inherited a country fractured by religious violence, battered by foreign threats, and wary of monarchs who loved too hard or too recklessly. She chose a different path. She would not marry. To some, it was a personal decision. To others, political genius. But beneath the glitter of the Golden Age lay a deeper truth. Elizabeth knew what Henry's obsession with succession had cost. 6 wives, 2 religions, thousands of deaths. Instead, she married England, and with the help of myth-makers and portraits, she recast herself as the Virgin Queen, divine, eternal, untouchable, a living goddess who would rule alone. It was not love that preserved her throne. It was fear, calculation, and her refusal to repeat her father's mistakes. Even now, Henry's legacy refuses to fade. He is said to haunt Hampton Court, striding through candlelit halls, dragging his wounded leg behind him. Visitors report strange sounds, groans, footsteps, even shouting. Whether real or imagined, the ghost fits. After all, Henry never truly left the stage. He haunts the nation he reshaped through the Church of England he created, the dynastic chaos he sparked, and the centuries of conflict over religion, rule, and identity. Every monarch who followed has lived in his shadow. Every debate about power, marriage, divorce, and faith in Britain bears his fingerprints. He wanted a legacy of glory. He left a legacy of ghosts. And so the story of Henry VIII does not end with his death. It seeps through the stones of palaces, echoes in the cries of martyrs, and lingers in the portraits of queens who refused to marry. A king obsessed with control lost even that in the end. All that remains is the shadow he cast, a shadow long and chilling, cast across the centuries, where power and ruin walk hand in hand. And that will be all for today's story. Thank you so much for being here with me today.